In the heart of medieval Europe, justice was not weighed upon scales of fairness but forged in the flames of fear, superstition, and divine authority. And in a world where kings ruled by the will of God and peasants toiled under the burden of feudal duty, there existed a belief that no mortal judge could truly uncover the truth, as well as the Almighty himself, and so trials were often not left to reason or evidence but to ordeal, the brutal tests of endurance and pain that were believed to reveal guilt or innocence through divine intervention. For the medieval mind was convinced that God would not allow the innocent to suffer unjustly, and this conviction became the bedrock of ordeals that ranged from fire and water to combat and poison, each ritual soaked in a blend of sacred ritual and raw cruelty. And though today such practices seem savage, in their time they were accepted as the ultimate instruments of truth. In a small village nestled beneath the looming walls of a baron's castle, the peasants knew well the fear of accusation, for to be named a thief, a witch, or a heretic meant more than shame. It meant subjection to an ordeal, and once accused, the path was rarely smooth, for the Lord's court would summon the accused before clergy and knights, where the charges were read aloud, and the accused was then handed to priests who prepared the trial, sanctifying fire or water, blessing swords, chanting prayers, and summoning divine presence into the instruments of judgment. The villagers whispered of these ordeals in hushed tones, for the sight of them had scarred their memories, the smell of burning flesh as hands were pressed to hot irons, the gasps as bound bodies sank or floated in cold rivers, the cries echoing in stone courtyards as combatants fought to the death in God's supposed court of justice. The ordeal was not justice as we would see it now, but it was the framework of law in an age when few could read, evidence was scarce, and faith in God's hand was stronger than any lawyer's tongue. The ordeal of fire, feared above all, demanded that the accused carry a red-hot iron across a set number of paces, or plunge a hand into a cauldron of boiling water. And after this was done, the wound was bound and sealed, then inspected days later by priests, who declared guilt if the flesh festered and innocence if it healed clean. And though this seems nothing but a gamble with suffering, it was rooted in a sacred conviction that God would protect the pure of heart, and in some strange way many believed. They saw miracles in those who survived with unscarred skin. The ordeal of water carried its own terror, for the accused would be bound and cast into a river or pond, the logic being that water, pure and blessed by God, would reject the guilty and cause them to float, but receive the innocent who would sink. And though this ordeal spared some, many drowned before priests could drag them out, their fate sealed not by sin, but by the weight of rope and the indifference of rushing currents. Trial by combat stood apart, for it was not reserved for peasants alone, but often for knights and nobles as well. A grim duel where the combatants fought until one yielded or died, the victor declared righteous by God's hand. And though it sounds like crude sport, for medieval lords it was the surest way to resolve disputes when words failed and faith taught them that God would not allow injustice to triumph with the stronger sword. In this dark theatre of justice, religion was not separate from law but its foundation, and every ordeal began with solemn prayers, masses, and invocations of saints, as if brutality was sanctified through holy words, and the church, though it sometimes hesitated at the cruelty, nonetheless stood as both witness and enforcer. For priests themselves often carried out the rituals, blessing irons, sprinkling holy water, and judging wounds, their authority sealing the verdicts of heaven. Though behind closed doors some clergy doubted whether these trials truly reflected God's will, or merely human cruelty. To the peasant, however, doubt mattered little, for to stand accused was to be marked, and survival depended as much on the whims of the powerful as on divine grace for those with favor of lords, or the wealth to bribe officials often found lighter ordeals or sympathetic judges, while the poor and powerless faced the full horror of justice unshielded. Thus, in the medieval world, justice was less a pursuit of truth and more a stage where power, faith, and fear played their parts, and ordeals became spectacles that etched terror into the minds of all who witnessed them. The fire burned, the water drowned, the swords clashed, and the people believed, for in the end they had no choice but to believe. For to question the ordeal was to question the very order of the world and the justice of God. And such defiance carried dangers far beyond the ordeal itself. And so, the shadow of justice hung heavy over every town and village, a looming presence that reminded all men and women that their fates lay not in reasoned courts, but in the mysterious will of heaven revealed through pain, blood and endurance. And this shadow would linger for centuries, shaping the lives of countless souls, until the tides of history slowly shifted and reason began to challenge faith's dominion over law. But in these early chapters of medieval life, the ordeal was unquestioned, brutal, and final, a terrifying mirror of the world's harshness itself. The ordeal of fire, feared above all others, stood as the most dreadful test of innocence, for it demanded not only faith but also flesh, and those condemned to face it carried upon their shoulders the weight of both their souls and their bodies. And in the medieval imagination, flame was a purifier, a holy element that burned away falsehood and revealed truth. And thus the church and the courts believed that by touching or carrying heated iron, or plunging hands into boiling water, the Almighty would shield the innocent from lasting harm, but expose the guilty through burns and wounds that festered and failed to heal. The ritual was not a crude affair of sudden violence, but a carefully staged ceremony, where priests, lords, and villagers gathered to witness what they believed was God's hand at work. And before the iron was heated, prayers were sung, incense was lit, and the accused was commanded to swear oaths before the altar, declaring innocence beneath the eyes of heaven. And only then would the executioners set to work, stoking the fire until the iron glowed white and the air shimmered with heat, each crackle of wood a grim prelude to suffering. The crowd would stand in tense silence, their faces painted with both fear and awe, for they believed that what they were about to see was no mere punishment, but a revelation, a window into the divine. And even those who pitied the accused dared not speak against the ordeal, for to doubt the flame was to doubt God himself. When the iron reached its fiercest glow, the priest would bless it, making the sign of the cross and chanting words that transformed cruelty into sacred trial. And the accused, trembling, would be ordered to approach, the heat already searing their skin from afar. And with every hesitant step they prayed silently that God would spare them, that innocence would grant them strength beyond mortal limits. Yet too often fear weakened the knees, for who could carry iron without agony, with hands bare? The accused would take the glowing metal, holding it as commanded, sometimes for 3 measured paces, sometimes for longer, and then drop it, flesh already blistered, skin peeling. The pain so sharp it drew cries that echoed through the church or courtyard. And afterward the wound was bound in linen blessed by priests, sealed and hidden until the appointed day, when it would be inspected. For 3 days the accused would live in torment, the bandage their only shield, and all the while their fate rested not in reasoned defense, but in the state of their wound. For if the burn festered, if it turned black or stank of infection, the priests would declare them guilty. But if it miraculously healed clean, they were proclaimed innocent and set free, their scars considered a holy mark of divine mercy. Yet in truth, infection was common, healing uncertain, and often the outcome was shaped as much by the priest's interpretation as by the wound itself. For those in favor with lords, or cloaked in wealth, found more lenient judgments, while the poor often faced the harshest reading of their burns, their suffering compounded by the weight of their low birth. The ordeal of boiling water bore similar cruelty, demanding that the accused plunge an arm into a cauldron where water bubbled like molten glass, sometimes to retrieve a stone or ring, placed at the bottom, sometimes merely to withstand the burning liquid for a set time. And as steam rose like the breath of dragons, the villagers would recoil in both horror and reverence, watching flesh hiss and redden, hearing the cries of agony echo against stone walls. And when the arm was withdrawn, blistered and raw, it too would be bound and judged in the days that followed, the verdict again hinging upon the strange, uncertain progress of wounds. To the medieval eye, the ordeal was fair, for it was God himself who chose to heal or to curse. But to modern minds it was little more than torture disguised as divine law. And in truth many suffered not because they were guilty, but because the human body could not resist such damage. And yet the faith of the time was so deep that both victim and accuser often believed in the justice of the outcome, however cruel. Stories of miraculous survival spread through villages like fire itself. Tales of women whose hands bore no mark after clutching iron, of men who plunged into boiling water only to emerge unscathed, and whether true or embellished. Such stories strengthened the people's faith in ordeals, for they seemed proof that heaven did intervene, that innocence was rewarded and guilt punished. And so generation after generation, the iron and the flame remained instruments of truth, until reason began to whisper doubts into the ears of kings and bishops, doubts that would in time grow too loud to ignore. Yet for the centuries when ordeals ruled the courts, fire was both enemy and judge, feared as an earthly torment but revered as a heavenly messenger, and the villagers who gathered around its glow knew that in its light, lives could be broken or saved, and so the ordeal of fire remained the most dreaded of all, a symbol of justice that burned us, bright as it destroyed. If fire was the purifier of truth in medieval courts, water was its silent judge, and though it seemed gentler than flame, it bore its own cruel mystery, for the ordeal of water was among the most feared and fatal of all trials, a test that pitted the body not against heat, but against the very element that gave life and the logic behind. It was simple in the minds of the age. Water, blessed and holy, would reject the guilty, causing them to float as if cast away by its purity, but would embrace the innocent, allowing them to sink beneath its surface, welcomed into its depths as one who carried no sin. And while such reasoning may seem twisted to the modern mind, to the medieval believer it made sense, for they thought nature itself carried the judgment of God. The ritual of water began not with violence but with solemn ceremony. The accused brought forth before a crowd that gathered by the river bank, the pond or the moat, the clergy chanting prayers and sprinkling holy water, blessing the currents so that the act of drowning might be transformed into the hand of divine revelation, and the accused, bound hand and foot, was then cast into the water before the eyes of both villagers and lords, their fate sealed not by words but by the struggle of their body against the current. The crowd would watch with bated breath as the accused sank or floated, some gasping when the body bobbed to the surface, others crying out in sorrow when it slipped beneath the water. And in both cases terror gripped the onlookers, for whether the accused rose or fell, the ordeal carried no mercy. If they floated, they were declared guilty, the water having rejected them, and they would be dragged back to shore only to face execution or further punishment. But if they sank, it meant innocence, though too often the innocent drowned before priests or guards could drag them free, their souls proven pure, yet their lives lost to the same justice that sought to save them. In the silence that followed, villagers would whisper of God's judgment, some praising the fairness of the ordeal, others quietly mourning. But none dared to question the system aloud, for to do so was to risk being named a heretic or even facing the same cold trial themselves. The ordeal of water thus held a special terror, for it demanded no endurance of fire, nor strength of combat, but rather surrender to the element itself, and in its depths many found only death, their innocence proven too late for earthly reprieve. Records tell of witches thrown into rivers, their bodies bound, their faces pale with fear, as villagers crowded the banks, some secretly hoping to see guilt confirmed, others praying silently that the accused might sink and thus prove innocence. And yet history shows that many floated, not because they were guilty, but because the bindings or air trapped in their garments kept them above the water's surface, and once declared guilty, they were often executed swiftly by hanging or burning, their ordeal serving as both trial and sentence. Knights to sometimes face the water, accused of treachery or cowardice, and though their armor would drag them down into the depths, proving innocence, survival was rare, and so many noblemen perished in silence beneath the rippling surface, their names cleared even as their lives ended, a grim irony that left widows and orphans to ponder the fairness of such divine law. Still, to the medieval mind, such outcomes were not contradictions but affirmations, for death in innocence was seen as a path to heaven, while survival in guilt was a curse that condemned the soul, and so water's cold embrace became both executioner and redeemer, claiming lives yet purifying reputations. Priests who oversaw these ordeals often cloaked their rituals in grandeur, chanting psalms, invoking saints, and reminding all present that this was not mere drowning but a sacred act, a courtroom where heaven itself presided, and the water was not ordinary water but a vessel of divine judgment, blessed and sanctified, transformed into a mirror of the soul. Yet behind this solemn theatre lurked corruption, For many times the outcome depended less on divine will and more on the power of influence, as lords and wealthy men could bribe officials to ensure that the bindings were loose, the water calm, or the inspection lenient, while peasants and the poor were given no such mercy, their fate bound not only by ropes but by the cruel imbalance of medieval society. To the watching villagers, however, such truths remained hidden, for the spectacle of water's judgment carried too much weight, too much fear, and so they accepted the verdict as the will of God. However tragic, the ordeal of water left a lasting mark upon communities, for its memory lingered long after the accused had drowned or been executed, and villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, telling their children of the day when justice was seen in the river, when a man or woman's soul was revealed beneath the surface, and such stories became warnings passed through generations. To be accused was to risk the water, and to risk the water was to risk both life and soul. Thus, the cold embrace of water became a symbol of both fear and faith, feared for its cruelty yet revered as the clearest window into heaven's judgment, and those centuries would later sweep away such practices. In the medieval world the river was as much a courtroom as the castle hall, and in its depths the fate of many was sealed forever. Among all ordeals of the medieval world, none stirred more and terror than the ordeal of combat, the trial by battle that turned the courtroom into an arena and made swords maces, and shields into instruments of divine justice, for in the minds of the people, God himself was believed to guide the strong arm and protect the righteous blow, ensuring that truth would emerge through victory and that guilt would be struck down in blood. The origins of this ordeal stretched deep into the customs of the Germanic tribes who believed disputes could be settled by force of arms. And when Christianity spread across Europe, this warrior tradition was not abolished, but sanctified, clothed in the garments of divine law, so that combat became more than a duel of men. It became a sacred test where heaven was the hidden judge. The accused and accuser would appear before the Lord's court, armed and armored. Sometimes knights of noble blood, other times peasants compelled to fight in rags. And when no witnesses or proof could settle the matter, the judge would declare the case to be decided by combat, and the field was prepared as both battlefield and holy ground. Priests would bless the ground, sprinkle holy water upon weapons, and declare that the fight was not mere violence but trial, and as the crowd gathered, men, women, and children alike pressed close, eager yet fearful to see God's judgment revealed through steel. The combatants stood before each other, their eyes heavy with dread, for they knew the outcome was not only legal but mortal, and once the signal was given they would fight until one could no longer stand, until one yielded, or lay dead, for mercy was rare and surrender itself often counted as guilt. And so many fought with the desperation of condemned men, striking and parrying, their breaths ragged, their faces streaked with sweat and blood. In the clash of weapons the villagers saw more than skill, they saw heaven's hand, for if the guilty won, then perhaps the victim had been falsely accused, but if the accused fell, his guilt was sealed in the silence of his corpse. Some battles were swift, decided by a single stroke, while others dragged on for hours, the combatants collapsing from exhaustion before delivering the fatal blow. And in such moments the judges declared the survivor to be the righteous one, their wounds seen as badges of divine truth. The ordeal by combat was not limited to men of war alone, for even women could be called to fight, though their battles were shaped by strange customs. A woman accused might be pitted against a man, yet to balance strength, she would be armed with stones or placed within a pit up to her waist, while her opponent circled with only one arm free, a grotesque parody of fairness that still left her at mercy of strength and brutality. Yet history records women who triumphed, their victory proclaimed as God's voice, silencing false accusers. For the knightly class trial by combat carried particular weight, for their honor was the cornerstone of their lives, and to be accused of treachery, cowardice, or dishonor was a wound worse than death. So they often demanded combat as the surest way to clear their names, trusting in both their skill at arms and their faith that God would not allow a righteous knight to fall. Great fields became stages for such ordeals, watched by nobles, clergy, and peasants alike, turning the pursuit of justice into a grim spectacle, half duel, half holy rite. Some combats became legendary, sung by minstrels as proof of divine intervention, when a frail man defeated a mighty foe, or when a knight struck down an accuser. who had sought to ruin him with lies. And such tales only deepened the people's belief that the sword was the tongue of God, sharper than any words spoken in court. Yet behind this glory lay darker truths, for strength and training mattered, and often the guilty triumphed simply because they were skilled or well armed, while the innocent perished, their blood soaking the ground, and though some whispered doubts most accepted the result as binding, for to question the ordeal was to question heaven itself. The brutality of trial by combat echoed beyond the battlefield, for it reminded every soul in medieval society that justice was not found in parchment or persuasion, but in the clash of steel and the shedding of blood, and lords wielded it as both law and intimidation, knowing that few would dare defy an accusation if it meant facing a stronger foe in combat. Yet even in its cruelty, trial by combat carried a strange allure, for it promised finality, no endless arguments, no doubts left lingering, but a clear outcome etched in wounds and death. And so the ordeal of combat endured through centuries, standing as both the pride of knights and the terror of commoners, until at last kings and churchmen began to question whether justice should be written in blood or in reason. But in the age of faith and fear, the sword was law, the battlefield was the courtroom, and the victor stood not only as survivor, but as God's chosen vessel of truth. In the theatre of medieval justice, the church did not stand apart as a distant observer, but strode boldly onto the stage draped in authority. And sanctity for ordeals could not exist without priests, relics, blessings, and prayers, and so the clergy became the gatekeepers of truth, lending divine legitimacy to acts that otherwise might seem like cruelty. To the medieval mind it was unthinkable to test guilt with fire, water, or combat, unless those elements had first been consecrated, for only by the church's hand could they become instruments of God, rather than mere tools of men. And so every ordeal began beneath the shadow of the cross, with incense, chants, and rituals that transformed brutality into sacred trial. Priests would bless the glowing iron, sanctify the boiling cauldron, sprinkle holy water upon dueling grounds, and consecrate the very ropes used to bind the accused. And in these gestures lay both power and control, for by placing themselves at the center of every trial, the clergy ensured that justice could not move without their voice. The church's involvement was not born merely of duty, but of belief, for the clergy themselves often preached that ordeals revealed divine will, that God would not permit the innocent to be condemned, and they wielded scripture to support their claims, citing verses that spoke of fire as purifier, of water as cleanser, of God as warrior in battle. Yet beneath the surface of this faith lay human flaws, for priests were men, and men were swayed by fear, influence, and gold. In many courts, wealthy nobles received gentler ordeals, shorter distances with the hot iron, cooler water in the cauldron, lighter bindings before immersion, while peasants endured the harshest tests, their wounds or struggles judged with unforgiving eyes. The church, meant to be a beacon of fairness, sometimes became the tool of the powerful, and those sermons declared that God's will alone decided outcomes, many knew in their hearts that men's hands guided the verdicts as much as heaven's. Still, to the common villager, the sight of priests chanting prayers before an ordeal was both terrifying and comforting, for their voices wrapped cruelty in sanctity, transforming human suffering into divine spectacle, and their authority silenced doubt, for none dared to challenge a verdict that came from both the church and the Lord. The ordeal was therefore not simply a legal test, but a religious ritual, and a courtroom more often resembled a chapel than a council chamber, with relics, candles, and psalms filling the air, and those accused stood as penitents, not only pleading innocence, but entrusting their very souls to the mercy of God through the hands of his clergy. Priests judged wounds after ordeals, peering at festering burns or raw flesh to declare guilt or innocence, and their words sealed fates as surely as any sword, for no appeal could overturn their verdict, and to question them was to risk excommunication, heresy, or worse. Thus the church became not only witness but judge, its hand pressed upon the scales of justice in ways that shaped the destiny of thousands. There were, however, murmurs within the church itself, for not all priests were blind to the cruelty of ordeals, and some questioned whether God truly chose to reveal innocence through burns and drownings, or whether men merely cloaked brutality in holy garb. And as centuries passed, these doubts grew louder. Councils debated the morality of ordeals, bishops whispered of reform, and papal voices began to rise against the practice. But in the age when faith was law, such doubts remained hidden beneath the grandeur of ritual. For most of the medieval centuries, the clergy remained firm allies of ordeals, and their presence was essential, for without them the ordeal would lose its sacred power. Reduced to torture without meaning, brutality without sanctity, the villagers who witnessed ordeals rarely saw corruption. What they saw was holy ritual, a priest lifting his hands to heaven, invoking saints to watch us, fire burned or water swallowed. And in that moment they believed justice was unfolding before their eyes, guided not by lords or laws but by God himself. And so the church, willingly or not, bound itself to the ordeals, weaving its authority into every wound and every drowning, ensuring that faith and justice were inseparable, and that no man could be declared guilty or innocent without first kneeling before the altar. Thus, the clergy became the silent architects of medieval justice, cloaking human cruelty in divine robes, and their role as judge and witness would shape not only the lives of the accused, but the conscience of an entire age. In the theatre of medieval justice, the church did not stand apart as a distant observer, but strode boldly onto the stage draped in authority. And sanctity for ordeals could not exist without priests, relics, blessings, and prayers, and so the clergy became the gatekeepers of truth, lending divine legitimacy to acts that otherwise might seem like cruelty. To the medieval mind it was unthinkable to test guilt with fire, water, or combat, unless those elements had first been consecrated, for only by the church's hand could they become instruments of God, rather than mere tools of men. And so every ordeal began beneath the shadow of the cross, with incense, chants, and rituals that transformed brutality into sacred trial. Priests would bless the glowing iron, sanctify the boiling cauldron, sprinkle holy water upon dueling grounds, and consecrate the very ropes used to bind the accused. And in these gestures lay both power and control, for by placing themselves at the center of every trial, the clergy ensured that justice could not move without their voice. The church's involvement was not born merely of duty, but of belief, for the clergy themselves often preached that ordeals revealed divine will, that God would not permit the innocent to be condemned, and they wielded scripture to support their claims, citing verses that spoke of fire as purifier, of water as cleanser, of God as warrior in battle. Yet beneath the surface of this faith lay human flaws, for priests were men, and men were swayed by fear, influence, and gold. In many courts, wealthy nobles received gentler ordeals, shorter distances with the hot iron, cooler water in the cauldron, lighter bindings before immersion, while peasants endured the harshest tests, their wounds or struggles judged with unforgiving eyes. The church, meant to be a beacon of fairness, sometimes became the tool of the powerful, and those sermons declared that God's will alone decided outcomes, many knew in their hearts that men's hands guided the verdicts as much as heaven's. Still, to the common villager, the sight of priests chanting prayers before an ordeal was both terrifying and comforting, for their voices wrapped cruelty in sanctity, transforming human suffering into divine spectacle, and their authority silenced doubt, for none dared to challenge a verdict that came from both the church and the Lord. The ordeal was therefore not simply a legal test, but a religious ritual, and the courtroom more often resembled a chapel than a council chamber, with relics, candles, and psalms filling the air. And those accused stood as penitents, not only pleading innocence but entrusting their very souls to the mercy of God through the hands of his clergy. Priests judged wounds after ordeals, peering at festering burns or raw flesh to declare guilt or innocence, and their words sealed fates as surely as any sword, for no appeal could overturn their verdict, and to question them was to risk excommunication, heresy, or worse. Thus the church became not only witness but judge, its hand pressed upon the scales of justice in ways that shaped the destiny of thousands. There were, however, murmurs within the church itself, for not all priests were blind to the cruelty of ordeals, and some questioned whether God truly chose to reveal innocence through burns and drownings, or whether men merely cloaked brutality in holy garb. And as centuries passed, these doubts grew louder. Councils debated the morality of ordeals, bishops whispered of reform, and papal voices began to rise against the practice. But in the age when faith was law, such doubts remained hidden beneath the grandeur of ritual. For most of the medieval centuries, the clergy remained firm allies of ordeals, and their presence was essential, for without them the ordeal would lose its sacred power. Reduced to torture without meaning, brutality without sanctity, the villagers who witnessed ordeals rarely saw corruption. What they saw was holy ritual, a priest lifting his hands to heaven, invoking saints to watch as fire burned or water swallowed. And in that moment they believed justice was unfolding before their eyes, guided not by lords or laws, but by God himself. And so the church willingly, or not, bound itself to the ordeals, weaving its authority into every wound and every drowning, ensuring that faith and justice were inseparable, and that no man could be declared guilty or innocent without first kneeling before the altar. Thus the clergy became the silent architects of medieval justice, cloaking human cruelty in divine robes, and their role as judge and witness would shape not only the lives of the accused, but the conscience of an entire age. The ordeal was not confined to the court, the altar, or the battlefield. It seeped into the very soul of the medieval village, casting long shadows across cottages, fields, and marketplaces, until fear itself became part of daily life, for the threat of accusation hung over every man, woman, and child like an unseen sword. To be accused, whether guilty or innocent, was to face the possibility of ordeal, and the ordeal was less a trial than a sentence, for once chosen, it carried pain, humiliation, or death. And so villagers walked carefully among one another, their words measured, their actions watched, their reputations guarded as though they were shields. Rumors became weapons sharper than daggers, for a whispered word of theft, witchcraft, or blasphemy could drag a soul before the Lord's court, and once there, few escaped the ritual of ordeal. For witnesses were rare, literacy scarcer still, and faith demanded proof from God rather than man. Thus the ordeal thrived not merely as a legal mechanism, but as a constant reminder that the eyes of heaven and the tongues of neighbors could at any moment turn life into torment. Children grew up hearing stories of fire and water whispered by parents as warnings. "Oh baby, honest, fear God." For the ordeal awaits liars, and these tales shaped their minds long before they ever saw one with their own eyes. The first sight of an ordeal was often unforgettable: the glow of iron in a darkened hall, the hiss of flesh in boiling water, the thrash of bodies in combat, and those who witnessed such scenes carried them forever, the memory resurfacing in dreams, shaping their sense of justice, morality, and fear. The community as a whole bore the weight of each ordeal, for when one man or woman was accused, all felt the tremor, families prayed desperately, neighbors whispered, children watched in dread, and the outcome rippled outward, strengthening belief. If innocence was proclaimed, deepening terror; if guilt was punished, even the dead left shadows, for when an innocent perished by ordeal, the village bore the contradiction in silence, unwilling to voice doubt, yet carrying unease in their hearts. And when a guilty man triumphed in combat or healed miraculously, villagers spoke of dark bargains, with the devil struggling to reconcile faith with reality. Superstition flourished in this atmosphere, twining with ordeal until the two were inseparable, for villagers believed that omens foretold outcomes, that a crow circling the churchyard or a sudden storm before a trial was heaven's voice. And such signs carried weight equal to the ordeal itself, shaping expectations before the fire was even lit. Mothers clutched charms, fathers whispered prayers, accused men clung to relics, believing that saints might intervene if invoked with enough devotion. And in this way the ordeal was not just a test, but a drama of belief, where every villager participated through hope, fear, or rumor. Some communities grew divided by ordeals, families turning against one another when oaths failed or wounds festered, while others drew closer, rallying to defend neighbors they believed wrongly accused. Yet always, whether uniting or dividing, ordeals transformed villages into stages of collective emotion, where justice was not abstract but lived, witnessed, and remembered. The psychological toll was immense, though few in those days had words to name it. For to see loved ones burn, drown, or fight was to carry trauma in silence, and yet the people endured, because they believed endurance was the price of divine order. Fear became not merely an emotion, but a tool of control, wielded by lords and clergy alike. For as long as the ordeal was accepted, their authority remained unchallenged, rooted in the conviction that justice belonged to heaven alone. This fear reached into every corner of life, markets where disputes over prices carried the threat of accusation, fields where quarrels over land could escalate into ordeals, taverns where drunken words might spark trials of fire, water, or combat. Even marriages and inheritances were touched, for accusations of infidelity, witchcraft, or illegitimacy often ended in ordeals, leaving entire families ruined or vindicated by wounds and deaths. Thus ordeal was not distant from daily life, but interwoven with it, a constant reminder that every act carried the potential for divine scrutiny. To the modern eye, such a world seems suffocating, bound by superstition and cruelty. Yet to the medieval villager it was the natural order, as constant as the seasons and as unavoidable as death. They did not question the ordeal, for questioning it meant questioning God, and to doubt God was unthinkable. Instead, they carried fear like a second skin, shaping their lives around it, obeying laws, attending Mass, guarding their reputations, hoping always to avoid the gaze of accusation. And in this way, the ordeal, though brutal, became more than justice. It became the heartbeat of the village, pumping fear and faith through every soul, binding them together in a silent pact of obedience. The shadow of fear lay heavy, but in its darkness the medieval world found its strange, enduring order. In the chronicles of the Middle Ages, scattered among accounts of kings' wars and plagues, lie tales of ordeals that shaped not only individual destinies, but the very imagination of Europe. For these cases, whispered in taverns and written in monastic scripts, became examples, warnings, and legends retold for generations. They were not mere trials of common villagers, but ordeals that involved knights, queens, bishops, and saints, showing how no rank was beyond the reach of God's judgment. The great cases, preserved in parchment and memory, reveal both the cruelty and the strange majesty of ordeal, reminding us how a single moment of fire, water, or combat could determine the fate of kingdoms. One of the most famous ordeals is tied to Queen Emma of Normandy, mother of Edward the Confessor, accused of scandalous adultery in the 11th century. Her enemies, eager to discredit her, demanded she prove her innocence by trial of fire. According to legend, she was commanded to walk barefoot across 9 red-hot plowshares laid out in the church. Before a hushed congregation, Emma stepped forward, her body wrapped not in armor or finery, but in fragile human flesh, and as she walked, the crowd gasped, for her feet did not blister, nor did she stumble. She reached the other side unscathed, and the court declared her innocence. Chroniclers called it a miracle, proof not merely of her chastity, but of divine protection over the mother of a saintly king. This story, retold with awe, solidified faith in the ordeal, for if a queen could face fire and be preserved by God, then surely heaven's judgment could protect or condemn any soul. Another case often cited in the annals is that of ordeal by water, used not only on peasants but even on nobles accused of grave crimes in 1215, when King John's England was restless. Under the shadow of Magna Carta, one knight was accused of murder in a quarrel over land. He was lowered into a river bound hand and foot, surrounded by villagers who prayed and trembled, for they knew the water's refusal or acceptance of the man would determine life or death. According to the chroniclers, the knight sank, vanishing beneath the current, and though he was dragged back to shore nearly lifeless, the sinking was taken as proof of innocence. Water had accepted him. Yet his near drowning left him broken, coughing for days, his body weakened, and though declared innocent, he lived the rest of his life in shame and silence. For ordeal marked not only the guilty, but even those who survived. This story became a grim reminder survival could mean freedom, yet also left scars deeper than wounds. Equally famous were the ordeals of combat, celebrated in chansons and sagas, where knights staked their lives and honor on strength of arms. One tale tells of the knight Robert of Alton, accused of treason in the service of Henry II. Summoned to trial by combat, Robert faced his accuser in a tournament field surrounded by nobles, clergy and peasants alike, all eager to see God's will revealed in blood. The fight was long and brutal, steel ringing against steel, shields splintering, men gasping under the weight of armor. At last Robert drove his opponent to the ground, his sword raised high, but instead of striking, he demanded mercy. The court, however, saw his victory as divine vindication, God had given him strength. His accuser, condemned by defeat, was executed and Robert was restored to honor. Yet whispers followed him. Some claimed he had trained harder, fought smarter, and thus skewed the supposed neutrality of heaven's judgment, even in triumph. Ordeal left questions lingering in the air. The ordeal was also central to accusations of witchcraft, though this practice grew harsher in later centuries. One infamous story speaks of a woman in Germany accused of consorting with demons. She was bound and thrown into a pond while villagers prayed for her soul. According to the tale, the water rejected her. She floated upon the surface, screaming for mercy. Declared guilty, she was dragged out and burned at the stake. To the villagers, this was proof of her evil. Yet to later generations, her cries echoed as a symbol of injustice, for how could floating, a natural act, be taken as proof of devilry? Such cases showed the dark side of ordeal, how superstition could transform natural law into instruments of terror. There were even ordeals tied to saints. The hagiographies record miracles, where holy men and women endured fire or boiling oil unharmed, their bodies preserved as signs of sanctity. One saint, Saint Cunegunda, accused falsely of adultery, is said to have walked barefoot across glowing plowshares without injury, her survival proving not only her innocence but her holiness. These tales blurred the line between trial and miracle, showing how ordeal could elevate an accused not merely to freedom but to veneration. Yet they also reinforced the system itself, for if saints could endure fire by God's will, then surely common men must submit to the same test. The cumulative effect of these famous cases was immense, for they shaped public faith in the ordeal as a divine instrument. Queens, knights, saints, and peasants alike were subject to the same trials, making ordeal appear universal, binding all ranks under heaven's eye. Yet at the same time, these cases sowed seeds of doubt. For each miraculous survival or cruel death left unanswered questions. Was it truly God's judgment, or the accident of circumstance? Did Emma survive because of divine protection, or because the iron had cooled slightly in the drafty church? Did Robert triumph because God favored him, or because his training was superior? These questions, whispered quietly at first, would grow louder in later centuries, contributing to the eventual decline of ordeal. But in the height of the medieval world, such doubts were silenced by faith, and the legendary ordeals were retold with reverence, serving both as warnings and affirmations. Parents told their children of Emma's courage, of Robert's combat, of nameless witches condemned by water, and these stories etched fear and devotion deeper into the medieval heart. They were not merely trials of individuals, but performances of cosmic justice, spectacles where earth and heaven seemed to meet. And so the memory of these ordeals endured, not just in dusty manuscripts, but in the very imagination of a people who believed that in pain, fire, and blood, God himself spoke. From the very beginning, the ordeal was clothed in the robes of religion, for in a world where law and faith were inseparable, no trial could be trusted unless God himself was invoked. And so priests stood beside judges, altars stood beside anvils, and holy water mingled with the smoke of burning iron. To the medieval mind, ordeal was not simply a legal procedure but a sacred ritual, and its strength lay in the belief that the church sanctioned it. Without blessing, without liturgy, without sacred words, ordeal was mere cruelty. With them, it was transformed into divine judgment. Thus the church became both its architect and its guardian, shaping the way ordeals were conducted and believed. In parish churches across Europe, when a man or woman was accused, the priest would fast, pray, and consecrate the instruments of ordeal. A bar of iron destined to scorch flesh was sprinkled with holy water, blessed in the name of the Trinity, and placed upon the altar. The water in which a hand would be plunged was consecrated as though it were baptismal, made holy by the sign of the cross. Even the combat of knights was sanctified by priests, who invoked heaven's aid before swords clashed. This ritual framing gave ordeal its aura of inevitability when God was called upon by priest and congregation. Who could doubt that the outcome reflected his will? The accused entered not just a trial, but a sacrament of fear, where every gesture was weighted with divine authority. And yet, even as priests blessed fire and water, murmurs of unease grew within the higher ranks of the church. Scholars in cloisters and bishops in cathedrals asked uneasy questions. Could God truly be forced to act at human command? Was it not presumptuous to demand that heaven intervene every time a neighbor accused another of theft? Did the ordeal test guilt, or did it test endurance, luck, and chance? Some theologians warned that ordeals were temptations forcing God's hand, compelling him to show signs. Rather than trusting in his hidden will, this line of thought grew slowly but steadily, spreading like cracks in the stone foundations of the practice. The decisive moment came in the early 13th century when Pope Innocent III, a towering figure of medieval Christendom, sought to reform the Church and cleanse it of practices he deemed unworthy. In the year 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council gathered, summoning bishops and clergy from across Europe, and among the many decrees that reshaped medieval religion was one that would forever change justice. Priests were forbidden to bless ordeals. With this single stroke, the sacred aura of the ordeal was stripped away. Without the Church's blessing, fire became mere iron, water mere liquid, combat mere violence. The ritual was emptied of its divine authority, and across Christendom, rulers and judges were forced to reconsider their reliance on ordeal. The effect was not immediate. The centuries of habit do not vanish overnight. In some villages, ordeals continued in secret, with laymen conducting rituals stripped of clerical sanction, clinging to the old ways as they clung to old superstitions. In certain corners of Europe, ordeals lingered for decades, carried on by communities steeped in tradition to accept sudden change. Yet slowly, inexorably, the authority of the Church weighed heavier than local custom, and ordeals dwindled. Kings, deprived of priestly blessing, turned increasingly to written evidence, oaths, and emerging systems of inquest. Trials shifted from the altar to the court, from fire and water to parchment and witness. The decline of ordeal marked not only a change in legal procedure, but a profound shift in the medieval imagination. For centuries, men and women had believed that God's judgment could be seen with human eyes, revealed in blistered skin or victorious swords. Now they were told that heaven's will was not to be forced, that justice must be sought by human reason, by evidence and inquiry, by juries and documents. The transition was not smooth. Many resisted, clinging to the comfort of visible signs, preferring the drama of ordeal to the cold words of law. But the Church's decree could not be ignored, and in time ordeal was remembered more as legend than as practice. Still, the memory remained powerful. Preachers used old ordeals as moral lessons, reminding congregations of God's justice in ages past. Poets and storytellers wove them into sagas, keeping alive the drama of queens walking over plowshares, of knights battling to prove honor. Villagers told tales of ancestors who had endured fire or water, their stories passed down like relics. Though the ordeal was gone from courts, it lived on in memory, reshaped into folklore, a ghost of justice haunting the medieval mind. Thus, the Church, which had once clothed ordeal in sanctity, became its undoing. And with its fall, the brutality of fire and water gave way, slowly and unevenly, to the beginnings of a more rational justice. The ordeal, once seen as God's voice, was silenced by the very institution that had amplified it, and in that silence, Europe began the long journey toward new forms of law. The age of ordeal ended, but its shadow endured, a reminder of a world where justice was fire, water and pain, and where heaven itself was summoned to judge the souls of men. When the priests withdrew their blessings and the Church forbade the sanctification of fire and water, the ordeal did not vanish in a single night like smoke from a snuffed candle. Rather, it faded slowly like embers cooling in a hearth, leaving behind both warmth and scars. For generations, men and women who had grown up under the shadow of ordeal still spoke of it, as though it might return. And in some remote villages, the old ways continued stripped of their rituals, yet clung to by those unwilling to abandon what their fathers had trusted. But in the cities, in the courts of kings and bishops, new forms of justice began to take root, pushing aside the spectacle of ordeal and replacing it with the sober weight of law. The transformation was neither simple nor uniform. In England, the end of ordeal coincided with the growing strength of juries. Groups of local men sworn to declare the truth of disputes. These juries, at first little more than neighbors called upon to give their opinions, grew into the cornerstone of English law, offering judgments based on testimony and memory rather than the searing of flesh. What had once been left to the unpredictable will of God was now entrusted to human voices, flawed but communal. Across the Channel in France, royal inquests gained power, as officials dispatched by the Crown investigated crimes and disputes, gathering evidence and testimony. In the German lands, written charters and codified laws began to replace the ancient reliance on ritual, slowly weaving a web of rules that bound lord and serf alike. The ordeal, in vanishing, gave birth to a new order, the reign of written law, yet this shift was not without resistance. Many ordinary people mistrusted the new systems, for juries could be swayed by wealth or fear, and written laws were opaque to peasants who could not read. To them, ordeal had at least offered clarity. One either burned or healed, sank or floated, triumphed or died. Justice was visible, enacted before the eyes of all, leaving little room for secrecy. The new justice, by contrast, unfolded behind doors, in documents, in whispered testimonies, in verdicts pronounced without the fiery stamp of heaven. For this reason, nostalgia for ordeal lingered, and some longed for the brutal certainty of divine signs over the murky compromises of human judgment. Still, progress marched on. The kings of Europe saw advantage in abandoning ordeal, for systems of inquiry and juries placed greater power in their hands, drawing justice away from local priests and lords. Monarchs used law to expand their authority, building centralized courts, codifying statutes, and making royal justice the highest authority in the land. What had once been fragmented into countless local customs began to coalesce into larger, more uniform systems, and though corruption remained, the ordeal no longer held sway as the universal arbiter. By the late Middle Ages, only in stories and superstitions did it survive. The aftermath of ordeal was also cultural, for its disappearance reshaped the medieval imagination. Where once villagers had looked for God's will in flames and rivers, now they were taught to trust the written word, the testimony of peers, the reasoned judgment of magistrates. This did not erase faith. Europe remained deeply religious, but it redirected belief, teaching that justice was to be sought in human order rather than demanded from heaven. The very idea of responsibility shifted. No longer could one rely on ordeal to reveal innocence or guilt, but rather one had to defend oneself through argument, through allies, through evidence. Justice became not a miracle, but a struggle of reason. This new order laid the groundwork for future centuries. The jury system, in its rough beginnings, would grow into one of the defining features of English and later American law. Written codes spread across Europe, allowing laws to be recorded, interpreted, and studied. The idea of inquest and investigation became foundational, shaping the very way modern societies approach truth. And yet, even as these systems matured, the memory of ordeal endured, haunting the edges of law. Judges and jurists still invoked ordeal in sermons and lessons, reminding the faithful of the days when God spoke through fire and water. In the folklore of villages, grandmothers told children of queens walking barefoot across iron, of witches floating in ponds, of knights proving honor with blood. The ordeal, though gone from the courts, remained alive in story, caution, and myth. Thus the aftermath of ordeal was not merely the rise of new justice, but the coexistence of old memory and new reason. The medieval world moved forward, but it did not forget. It carried the scars of fire in its imagination, even as it wrote new laws on parchment. The ordeal had once been brutal justice, divine theatre, the stage where faith and fear met. In its end, it left behind silence and reflection, forcing men to trust themselves rather than demand signs from heaven. From fire, water, and combat arose the fragile beginnings of the modern law, and though the brutality ended, the lessons of ordeal lingered, reminders of a time when justice was measured in wounds, when truth was tested by agony, and when humanity's faith in God's hand burned brighter than any iron. The story of ordeal does not end with the snuffing out of fire, the drying of rivers, or the silencing of swords. It lingers like smoke after a great burning, drifting through centuries, staining memory, haunting imagination, whispering of a time when human hands sought divine judgment through pain. To understand ordeal is to walk again among the people who lived under its shadow, the peasants, Who trembled at accusation? The nobles who staked honor on combat. The priests who blessed iron and water, believing their rituals bound heaven to earth. It is to stand in crowded churchyards, where entire villages gathered to see who would be chosen by God and who would be condemned. To hear the hushed prayers of mothers, the desperate cries of the accused, the stern proclamations of judges. It is to feel the heat of glowing metal, the sting of scalding water, the pounding of swords, and to realize that for those people, this was not cruelty, it was justice. For centuries, ordeal gave order to chaos. It was a ritual that made disputes visible, a performance that turned invisible guilt into scars or vindication. Villagers believed they saw God's hand at work in every wound that festered, every warrior who triumphed, every body that sank or floated. And though we now call it brutal, to them it was certainty. The certainty of a world in which heaven did not remain distant but reached down daily into fields, markets, and courts. The ordeal was terrifying, yes, but it was also comforting, for it reassured people that truth was not hidden forever, that God himself would speak through fire, water, or blood. Yet the ordeal was also a prison of fear. Accusation became a weapon sharper than any dagger, for once named. A person could not easily escape the ordeal's summons. Rumors destroyed families. Feuds led neighbors into combat. And superstition condemned women as witches or men as thieves. Even innocence could be fatal. The fire burned regardless of truth, and water drowned the blameless as surely as the guilty. For every queen who crossed plowshares unscathed, there were countless nameless villagers whose screams were lost to time. The ordeal was as much about control as about justice. Lords and priests wielded it to bind communities, to enforce obedience, to remind all that nothing was hidden from heaven's gaze. Fear kept order where laws were weak, and ordeal was the sharpest edge of that fear. The Church's rejection of ordeal did not erase the centuries it had ruled. When Pope Innocent III forbade priests to bless fire and water in 1215, he stripped ordeal of its sacred heart, but its ghost remained. In villages, people still whispered of miracles, still feared accusation, still told tales of ancestors judged by ordeal. The practice dwindled, yet memory clung to it stubbornly, like scars upon the body of Europe. In time, new systems arose: juries, written laws, royal inquests, and though they were imperfect, they carried justice away from fire and water into the realm of human reason. But the transition was not smooth. Many mourned the loss of certainty, for parchment and testimony seemed weak compared to the terrible clarity of fire. And so ordeal became story. Chroniclers preserved its most famous cases: queens proving chastity, knights proving loyalty, witches condemned by rivers. These tales entered folklore, recited by storytellers, sung by minstrels, painted into the memory of Europe. They became morality lessons, warnings against sin, affirmations of faith, demonstrations of God's supposed will. But beneath the piety, they also carried unease, for even the faithful could not ignore the cruelty, the injustice, the chance that pain and survival might tell lies as easily as truth. Slowly, doubt seeped into the narrative, transforming ordeal from proof of divine justice into a cautionary relic of the past. Today, looking back, we see ordeal as barbaric, yet in its cruelty lies a profound truth. It reveals the desperation of humanity's search for certainty. In an age without science, without forensics, without records, people yearned for proof that could not be bribed, that could not be corrupted. They longed for a justice beyond human failings, and in their yearning, they turned to ordeal. It was brutal, yes, but it was believed to be pure. That belief gave it power. That belief allowed countless flames to be lit, countless bodies to be scarred, countless lives to be ended in the name of truth. The ordeal's legacy is double-edged. On one hand, it warns us of the dangers of mingling faith with fear, of using pain as proof, of mistaking suffering for truth. On the other, it reminds us that justice has always been fragile, shaped by culture, by belief, by desperation. Our modern systems of evidence and law are built on the ruins of ordeal, forged out of centuries of trial, error, and reform. The jury, the written law, the investigation, these are children of the ordeal's collapse, born when the Church declared that God would not be forced to act at human command. Without ordeal's fall, our present justice might not have risen. And yet, the ordeal is not gone entirely. It lingers in memory, in story, in the fascination of historians and readers. It whispers to us of a time when justice was visible, when God was believed to speak through wounds. It tempts us to wonder, were some truly saved by miracles? Did heaven once answer the cries of the desperate? Or were all merely victims of chance, bound to a system both merciless and blind? These questions linger, not because ordeal was just, but because ordeal touched something deep in the human soul. The desire for certainty, the longing for truth beyond doubt. So the ordeal endures not in courts, but in imagination. Its fire has cooled, its waters stilled, its swords rusted, yet its shadow stretches across history, reminding us that justice has not always been mercy, that truth has not always been reason. Once it was fire, water, and blood. Once it was agony sanctified. Once it was the brutal theatre of faith. And though we have moved beyond it, though our courts no longer summon God through pain, we carry its memory still as a warning and as a mirror. The ordeal teaches us that justice without wisdom becomes cruelty, and that certainty, demanded too harshly, burns deeper scars than doubt. The medieval world has ended, but the ordeal remains alive in history. A ghost of fire and fear whispering forever in the story of humanity.